most sadistic execution methods used throughout history was immurement, or being walled in or entombed alive. This was when someone was usually walled in of an enclosed space with no exit, and they were then left to die. Throughout history, some people were enclosed inside of tiny spaces such as coffins, and this was used against women throughout the centuries. It was a sadistic and terrible execution method, and there were groups of women who were targeted for this form of treatment if they went against the way of life and what was expected of them. But what is the story of the immurement of women? Immurement goes back millennia, and in some countries it is even said to still be used today. In Europe it was used to punish severely. For example, in Latvia, there was a legend in which the daughter of a knight who lived in a castle did not approve of her father's choice of match for her husband. The knight was furious, and he then immured a handsome man who his daughter took a shine to. However, his daughter was then allegedly immured in one of the tunnels under his castle. In Sweden, another story emerged about a nobleman's daughter being immured inside of a tunnel after she had fallen in love with the man who her father did not allow her to marry. But one of the most famous cases of immurement was against a group of women known as the Vestal virgins. These were around during ancient Rome, and they were a class of priestesses who would maintain a sacred life which they devoted to the goddess of home and the family Vesta. These women lived a very strict life of chastity and celibacy, and if this was broken, then the women would be immured alive. It was said that, when condemned by the College of Pontifices, she was stripped of her viati and other badges of office and was scourged, attired like a corpse, placed into a closed litter, borne through the forum attended by her weeping kindred, with all the ceremonies of a real funeral, to a rising ground called the Campus Scalatorus. This was located just within the city walls, close to the Colleen Gate. A small vault underground had been previously prepared, containing a couch, a lamp, and a table with a little food. The Pontifex Maximus, having lifted up his hands to heaven and uttered a secret prayer, opened the litter, led forth the culprit, and placed her on the steps of the ladder which gave access to the subterranean cell. He delivered her over to the common executioner and his assistants, who led her down, drew up the ladder, and having fitted the pit with earth until the surface was level with the surrounding ground, left her to perish, deprived of all the tributes of respect usually paid to the spirits of the departed. The order of the Vestal Virgins existed for 1,000 years, and there were around 10 women who were walled in alive and were immured. Of course, men were, too, subjected to this treatment, but one of the most famous accounts of being walled in happened to the brutal and barbaric Hungarian Countess Elizabeth Bathory. She was a serial killer, who was known for drinking the blood of younger women, as she believed she would stay youthful. But after being caught, she was subjected to being walled in and immured. She was detained in a castle for the rest of her life, and she had been locked inside a bricked-up room, and there was no way out. But this happened for the deaths of several girls that had been killed. Many have regarded her as the most prolific female serial killer in history, and she was known as the Blood Countess. Elizabeth Bathory was allowed to live in immurement until she died, and she would be fed and kept alive, but she would die of causes other than starvation. Starvation was one of the main causes of death during immurement, and there was also a belief inside of Catholic monastic traditions for nuns to be immured if they broke their vows or were considered heretics. It was said one of the women that, in the case of Joanne, widow of B. de la Tour, a nun of Lebanese in 1246, who had committed acts of both Catherine and Waldstein heresy and had prevaricated in her confession, the sentence was confinement in a separate cell in her own convent, when no one was to enter or see her, her food being pushed in through an opening left for the purpose. In fact, the living tomb known as the in pace. Another writer, historian Walter Scott, stated that it is well known that the religious who broke their vows of chastity was subjected to the same penalty as the Roman Vestals in a similar case. A small niche, sufficient to enclose their bodies, was made in the massive wall of the convent. A slender pittance of food and water was deposited in it, and the awful words "Vade in pace" were the signal for immuring the criminals. It's not likely that, in latter times, this punishment was often resorted to, but among the ruins of the Abbey of Coldingham was some years ago discovered the remains of a female skeleton which, from the shape of the niche and the position of the figure, seemed to be that of an immured nun. There was also another case of a nun breaching her vow of chastity, and it was said of her punishment that, at Lodi in 1662, Sister Anita Margarita Lemira stood trial for having introduced a man into her cell and entertained him for a few days. She was sentenced to be walled in alive on a diet of bread and water. In the same year, the trial for breach of enclosure and sexual intercourse against the cleric Domenico Calgala and Sister Villancela Infanti of the convent of San Salvador in Arona had an identical outcome. So in Europe, there was a tradition of women being walled in, but as mentioned, men were also. A lot of the punishment was linked to religion and breaking sacred vows, and that they would be then almost shunned by society and would be forgotten about. The execution method is similar to being buried alive, and in Inca culture, there was one element in the Great Sun Festival that saw young maidens of between 10 and 12 years old being lowered into a waterless pit and then being walled in alive. But some of the most horrific immurements took place in Mongolia and happened as recently as the last century. These women were immured inside of small boxes and were locked in, and often they were subjected to this inside of the horrific Mongolian prisons. A news report from 1914 commented on these, and it was said, "The prisons and dungeons of the far eastern country contain a number of refined Chinese shut up for life in heavy iron-bound coffins, which do not permit them to sit upright or lie down. These prisoners see daylight for only a few minutes daily, when the food is thrown into their coffins through a small hole." But immurement and being walled in was a brutal and horrific execution method which would drive someone insane. It was used to grind someone down and to publicly condemn them for their crimes. As mentioned for women, these punishments were often linked to religion or breaking sacred vows. And because of this, they would then be walled inside different structures and be entombed alive. It must have been horrific and shocking to have happened. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.